November 1942. The sky above San Francisco was covered in a thin silver fog, cold and quiet, as if the whole bay was holding its breath. At the Richmond shipyard, thousands of people crowded along the wooden platforms surrounded by the hum of machines and the faint metallic clang of tools. Everyone was staring at a massive gray ship stretched before them, 441 feet long, nearly 30,000 tons of steel, named the Robert E. Peary. A complete Liberty ship built not in months, but in 4 days, 15 hours and 29 minutes. No one believed it. Every law of naval construction said a ship like this took at least 230 days, thousands of skilled craftsmen, and endless inspections. Yet here it was, whole, real ready to touch the water. When the long horn sounded, the giant vessel began to move, sliding down the greased rails with a sound that echoed through the fog, like thunder over steel. It struck the bay with a flash of white spray, and for a heartbeat, silence followed the kind of silence that only comes when people witness the impossible. Among the crowd stood Vice Admiral Emory Land, the man who had once declared that no ship could be properly built in less than half a year. Yet he was watching one right now. The Robert E. Peary was no dummy hull, no empty shell for publicity. It was complete with engines, decks, and cargo holds, a living vessel that would sail within days. At the edge of the dock stood Henry Kaiser, the man who had just overturned 3,000 years of shipbuilding tradition. He was not a naval engineer, nor a shipwright by trade. He had built dams and highways, not destroyers or freighters, but it was exactly that, his distance from tradition, that allowed him to see differently. He believed that if human beings could raise a dam in the middle of a desert, they could build a ship in a few days if only they learned how to organize. Kaiser never chased perfection. He chased efficiency. In his mind, a ship didn't have to be a masterpiece. It just had to float, carry cargo, and sail. While the old engineers obsessed over blueprints that measured every rivet, Kaiser divided the ship into hundreds of separate modules. The bow, the stern, the engine room, the deck house. Each was built in parallel, not in sequence. When finished, massive cranes lifted the pieces into place, joining them together like an enormous puzzle of steel. It was a revolution in logistics. He replaced sequence with simultaneity, craftsmanship with system. In traditional yards, a handful of master builders would work for months on one section. Kaiser trained thousands of new workers in weeks. They didn't have to know everything. One person learned to weld vertical seams, another horizontal plates, another curved hull joints, and they repeated those motions over and over like the rhythm of a machine made of people. By doing so, he turned ordinary citizens into an army of industrial builders. Women who once typed at office desks now stood beneath showers of sparks. Farmers who once guided plows now operated cranes taller than houses. People who had never seen the ocean were suddenly shaping the backbone of the fleet that would cross it. They weren't just building ships, they were learning what they were capable of. Out on the front line, soldiers didn't know it yet, but behind them stood another army, unarmed, unseen, yet vital. Every Liberty ship that rolled off the line meant food, fuel, and ammunition arriving in time. The Navy called it the mathematics of victory. When the Robert E. Peary touched the water, Henry Kaiser didn't cheer. He just smiled faintly. To him, this was not the end of a race. It was the proof of an idea. One man, a civilian who dared to defy centuries of tradition, had shown that innovation didn't require miracles, only a different way of thinking. A journalist standing nearby wrote later, "We did not just witness a ship being launched. We witnessed the future being welded by the hands of ordinary people, and maybe that was the true meaning of that afternoon. Not the record, not the spectacle, but the quiet realization that limits are rarely physical. They live in imagination and they vanish when someone dares to question them. Because sometimes, what launches a ship isn't steel at all. It's the belief that the impossible can be done if someone is bold enough to try." 2 years before that historic launch, few in America's shipbuilding world had even heard the name Henry J. Kaiser. He was a man known for building highways, dams, and airfields, not ships. On December 27, 1940, as the world slipped deeper into war, Kaiser signed his first shipbuilding contract with the United States Maritime Commission. He promised to deliver 30 cargo vessels for the British government within 2 years. The promise sounded absurd. He was 58 years old, had never built a single ship, and didn't even own a shipyard. Yet he signed his name anyway, confident not in his experience, but in his way of thinking. To those who built ships for a living, Kaiser's move felt like a joke. Men who had spent their lives near the ocean descendants of shipwrights who had built wooden hulls before the American Revolution called him reckless. At Todd Bath Iron Works in Maine, one of the oldest yards in the nation, executives rolled their eyes when the Maritime Commission paired them with Kaiser. They assumed his ignorance would collapse under the weight of naval tradition. But what they could not see was that ignorance in Kaiser's hands would become a weapon. Kaiser approached shipbuilding like an engineer of earth, not water. To him, a ship was simply another massive structure made of steel like a dam or a bridge, and thus could be divided, duplicated, and accelerated. He didn't want craftsmen, he wanted process. He didn't want tradition, he wanted speed. His first move was not to hire shipwrights, but to bring in engineers from his dam projects, men who knew how to move mountains of material and coordinate thousands of workers without waiting for perfect conditions. In early 1941, one of Kaiser's chief engineers, Clay Bedford, visited a Ford Motor Company assembly line in Detroit. He watched cars glide past rows of workers who added parts in rhythm, a living, breathing machine. When Bedford returned to California, he told Kaiser, "We can do this with ships. We just have to stop thinking like shipbuilders." It was a sentence that would quietly ignite one of the most dramatic industrial revolutions of the century. Traditional shipbuilders laughed at the idea. Cars, they said, were toys compared to ships. A ship was an organism alive with systems that had to be built in sequence: the keel, the ribs, the plates, the decks, the engine. To suggest building it like an automobile sounded like heresy. But Kaiser saw something else, not a contradiction, but a pattern. If ships could be broken into sections, prefabricated and joined, then the limits of time could be rewritten. He began sketching not ships, but shipyards, layouts that looked more like automobile plants than naval facilities. Instead of one long building slip where a hull was slowly assembled piece by piece, he imagined 7 parallel ways where multiple ships could rise at once. Around them would be open fields for prefabrication, where giant steel panels could be welded together before ever touching the water. Cranes would replace scaffolding. Rail lines would carry finished modules like arteries feeding a single heart. When Kaiser presented the plan to the Maritime Commission, the reaction was uneasy silence. Vice Admiral Emory Land, who would later stand at the Peary launch, reviewed the drawings and wrote privately, "This man is proposing to bet America's supply lines on unproven methods." The concern was understandable. In 1941, Germany's submarines were sinking Allied ships faster than shipyards could replace them. Britain was starving. The Atlantic was burning, and traditional yards still needed more than 6 months for one vessel. Land's choice was simple, but terrifying: trust a construction magnate who had never built a ship or accept defeat by arithmetic. Necessity tipped the scale. Kaiser got his chance. In January 1941, he sent surveyors to the empty mudflats of Richmond, California. By the end of that year, cranes towered where marsh grass once grew. The new shipyard didn't look like any the Navy had seen before. It was a machine disguised as a city, a grid of rail lines, gantries, workshops, and furnaces, all synchronized toward one-purpose output. Old-timers called it chaos. To Kaiser, it was order reinvented. The contrast was jarring. In New York and Bath shipyards still echoed with the rhythm of hammers striking hot rivets, a sound centuries old. In Richmond, there was no hammering. There was the hiss of welding torches, the flash of electric arcs, and the low rumble of cranes moving entire ship sections into place. Riveting, the heartbeat of shipbuilding tradition, was gone. In its place, welding faster, cheaper, but untested at such scale. When word reached the maritime establishment that Kaiser intended to weld whole hulls, outrage followed. The British Navy had long forbidden welding on warships, citing the risk of brittle fractures. To many, the plan sounded suicidal. But Kaiser had seen welding hold miles of pipeline through deserts and mountains. He believed it could hold the sea as well. His logic was brutally simple. If welding failed, America would lose ships slowly. If tradition continued, it would lose the war quickly. He once told Bedford, "They say this can't be done because it hasn't been done. That's not proof, that's fear." By late 1941, the first teams of workers arrived. They were not sailors or machinists, but teachers, farmers, secretaries, and waitresses who had answered newspaper ads promising high pay and free training. Kaiser looked at them and saw not inexperience, but possibility. He divided their labor into narrow tasks small enough to master, essential enough to matter. Within 2 weeks, an untrained worker could contribute to a ship's hull. Within a month, they could train others. While the world measured victory in battles, Kaiser measured it in hours. Every reduction in build time meant lives saved on the ocean. Every worker trained meant another link in a chain of survival. He wasn't fighting Germany directly. He was fighting time. That is how a man who had never built a ship became the most important shipbuilder in American history. Not by learning the old ways, but by refusing to obey them. And so, before the first Liberty ship even touched the water, the war for the future of industry had already begun. Not in the Atlantic, but on the mudflats of California, where a man with no naval pedigree dared to imagine ships rising every few days, not every few months. In the winter of 1941, the Richmond shipyard came alive with a strange new music. It was not the rhythmic clang of hammers or the metallic chorus of rivets being driven home. It was sharper, brighter, almost electric, the hiss and crackle of welding arcs dancing against the steel hulls of half-built ships. For the first time in maritime history, entire vessels were being fused together, not with rivets, but with fire. Traditional shipwrights who came to visit walked the site with quiet disbelief. For centuries, rivets had been the language of shipbuilding, heated until red hammered through overlapping steel plates and then sealed by hand. Each rivet was a tiny act of craftsmanship, a promise of durability. A good riveting crew might install 100 in a day. A Liberty ship built the old way needed more than 1,000,000. That math alone meant delay, exhaustion, and limits. Henry Kaiser saw that as a problem of time, not tradition. He asked a single question: what if the steel plates could be fused directly? No rivets, no overlaps, no teams of men passing hot metal from hand to hand. What if the bond came from electricity itself? He had used arc welding for pipelines and bridges across the West. It was faster, cheaper, and easier to teach. But applying it to the hull of an ocean-going ship, something that would face pressures, salt, and storms, was another matter. When Kaiser proposed replacing every rivet with welds, it was as if he had insulted the religion of shipbuilding. Vice Admiral Emery Land called the idea reckless. A report from the British Admiralty warned that welded hulls could crack under strain, splitting open like glass. A single flaw in the weld, they said, could doom the ship. But Kaiser, studying those reports late at night in his office, tapped a finger against the paper and said to his team, "We are already losing ships that were built the right way. So, what are we protecting, pride or progress?" In a sense, he wasn't just building ships. He was rewriting the psychology of production. Every tradition that once made the industry proud, precision, patience, craftsmanship, had become in his eyes an anchor dragging them down. He didn't want beauty. He wanted throughput. His mantra was simple: adequate ships built fast would carry more cargo than perfect ships built late, and in a war of attrition, adequate was victory. The first tests began quietly in early 1941. Welders, most of them newly trained, worked through the night on steel test plates under the glow of arc light. Sparks rained down like orange snow as inspectors checked for cracks. To everyone's surprise, the welds held. Not always clean, not always pretty, but strong. When a storm hit the bay a week later, the plates flexed under pressure and did not break. It was enough for Kaiser to push forward. Within months, the Richmond yard had banned rivets entirely. Every hull seam, every joint, every frame would be welded. Experienced shipwrights protested, claiming it would end in disaster. But as the first welded Liberty ship, the Patrick Henry, slid into the water that fall, something shifted. The ship floated. It steamed. It survived its maiden voyage. The skeptics went silent. The practical effects were staggering. Welding reduced labor by almost half. It eliminated entire categories of skilled work that once took years to master. Training a riveter required 4 years of apprenticeship. Training a welder under Kaiser's system took 2 weeks. The workforce expanded overnight, bringing in women, minorities, and anyone willing to learn. What had been an exclusive guild turned into a people's industry. Each spark from a torch became a symbol not just of speed, but of inclusion. It was the first time in American industry that women stood shoulder to shoulder with men on a scale so vast. Posters appeared across the yard, showing a woman in overalls and a welding helmet with the words, "Join the Builders of Victory." For many, it was the first steady paycheck, the first time their work shaped the course of history. But welding wasn't without risk. Cracks appeared in some ships as they faced the cold Atlantic. 3 Liberty ships split in half due to brittle fractures. Critics pounced, calling it proof that tradition had been right all along. Kaiser responded by gathering his engineers and metallurgists around the broken steel sections. They analyzed the failures like doctors studying wounds. Within months, they discovered the cause impurities in the steel, not the welding. They adjusted the alloy composition, improved preheating methods, and the problem vanished. The revolution continued. By mid-1942, welded construction had cut the average build time from 230 days to less than 70. Every week saved meant convoys arriving sooner, soldiers supplied faster, and fewer lives lost to starvation or isolation. Welding, once dismissed as dangerous, had become the heartbeat of Allied logistics. But perhaps the most profound change was not mechanical. It was psychological. Inside every spark that lit up the Richmond night was a small act of rebellion, proof that ordinary people could master complex technology, that expertise could be taught in days, that progress did not belong to the few who guarded it. Kaiser had taken the precision of the few and multiplied it across the many. The shipyards glowed through the night like cities made of fire. And under that fire, something larger than steel was being forged, a new definition of what human hands guided by faith and urgency could accomplish when tradition finally stepped aside. By the spring of 1942, the Richmond shipyards no longer looked like places where ships were built. They looked like factories where ships were born. From above, the yard stretched out like a giant circuit board, cranes swinging on scheduled trains carrying steel sections through the fog, workers moving in synchronized rhythm under the glare of floodlights that made night look like day. It was a vision borrowed not from the ocean, but from Detroit. Kaiser and his engineers had studied how Henry Ford built automobiles. In Detroit, every worker performed one precise task on a moving chassis. The product never waited. The work never stopped. Bedford Kaiser's chief engineer had walked those factory floors and returned convinced that ships could be built the same way. The challenge was scale. A ship was not a car. It was a floating city, a labyrinth of steel and machinery weighing thousands of tons. But Kaiser understood that the principles specialization and flow could be translated into steel and water. The traditional shipyard worked like a craftsman's workshop. One ship, one team, one slow sequence. The hull had to be finished before the deck could begin the engine room, before the machinery, the wiring after the bulkheads. Every step waited for the one before it. Kaiser's system destroyed that order. He replaced sequence with parallelism. He built what he called the horizontal factory, a system where every section of a ship could be built at the same time in different corners of the yard, and then joined together like pieces of a giant model kit. Under the new method, one crew welded the bow while another shaped the stern, a third assembled deck houses, and a fourth built the engine room. When each section was done overhead, cranes, some capable of lifting more than 150 tons, swung them into place on the building ways. What once took months now took days. The sound of hammering gave way to the hum of engines, the hiss of torches, and the whistle of cranes. The yard became an orchestra of motion. Every movement had a purpose. Railroad tracks ran directly through the yard, feeding prefabricated panels to assembly stations. Trucks moved alongside, carrying completed substructures from one zone to another. Overhead, gantries lifted entire cargo holds and lowered them into waiting hulls. Engineers compared the process to the bloodstream of a living organism, constant circulation, constant creation. For the workers, it felt like being inside something bigger than themselves. Each person performed a single task, welding, fitting, grinding, often without ever seeing the finished ship. Yet they knew that somewhere nearby, thousands of others were doing the same, and together their efforts would meet in the middle like converging rivers. It gave the work a strange beauty, a sense of unity that no traditional shipyard had ever known. The results astonished even Kaiser's own team. The first Liberty ship under the new system took 197 days to build. The second took 169. The fifth, 128. By the time the 10th ship rolled off the line, the build time had dropped below 100 days. Engineers began to joke that if Kaiser had a few more months, he'd figure out how to launch a ship before it was even started. In reports to Washington Navy, officials described what they called industrial shock. The old shipyards, Bath, Bethlehem, Newport News, could not believe the numbers. Many sent their own engineers to Richmond to investigate. What they found defied everything they had been taught. There were no master craftsmen watching over apprentices, no long benches covered in blueprints. Instead, there were giant walls of chalk markings where foremen sketched quick dimensions directly onto the steel. Workers made adjustments in real time. Perfection was no longer the goal. Flow was. Vice Admiral Howard Vickery, who had once opposed Kaiser's methods, visited the yard that summer. He walked the assembly lines, watched the sparks shower from hundreds of torches, and listened to the rhythm of cranes moving steel into place. In his report, he wrote, "Perfection is the enemy of sufficient. These ships are sufficient, and sufficient ships are what win wars." To many traditionalists, that sentence sounded like surrender. To Kaiser, it was vindication. He had proven that speed was not recklessness, it was strategy. The faster America could replace what was lost, the less power the enemy's submarines held. Every 4 days, shaved off production time meant thousands of tons of supplies reaching the front sooner. In wartime itself was a weapon. There was also a human rhythm to this machine. Shifts rotated around the clock, 3 groups working 8 hours each, 7 days a week. The lights of the yard never went dark. At 2 in the morning, the cafeterias were full, the air thick with the smell of coffee and smoke. Women with scarves tied under their welding helmets stood shoulder to shoulder with men covered in grease and grit. Somewhere in the noise, friendships formed the kind that could only exist among people who built something together that none of them could build alone. By late 1942, Richmond had become a living experiment in industrial democracy. The lines between engineer and laborer man and woman veteran and beginner blurred into insignificance. What mattered was that the next ship was always faster, always better organized, always closer to launch. Standing on a balcony overlooking the yard one evening, Henry Kaiser said quietly to a visiting journalist, "People think I'm building ships. I'm not. I'm building a system that builds ships. And he was right. The system he built would soon push the limits of speed so far that even his own engineers would doubt it. Because somewhere beyond efficiency lay something else, the moment when speed itself became a symbol of human will. That moment would come in November 1942 when a ship named the Robert E. Peary would rise from nothing and touch the water in less than 5 days, proving once and for all that what had once taken 230 days could now be done in 4. By the end of 1942, the Richmond shipyards no longer smelled only of steel and oil. They carried the scent of soap, tobacco, and cheap perfume, the human smell of an army that had never held a hammer before. The people who streamed through the gates each morning were not what anyone had once imagined as shipbuilders. They were farmers from Oklahoma, teachers from Kansas, mechanics, waitresses, secretaries, housewives. They came with no tools of their own, only calloused hands, courage, and the promise of a paycheck that could feed their families through a war. The newspapers called them Kaiser's Army. There were no uniforms, no medals, no ranks, just name tags, helmets, and the same mission: build faster than the enemy could destroy. The training yards became a school for the ordinary. Men and women who had never seen a welding torch learned in 10 days what had once taken 4 years of apprenticeship. Each learned one task, one motion, one exact point of precision, and repeated it hundreds of times a day. The method worked like a miracle. Within weeks, thousands of new workers could be placed on the production line. A grandmother from Iowa learned to weld vertical seams. A 19-year-old from Georgia became an expert at sealing deck plates. A mother of 3 from Oregon worked nights operating cranes that lifted whole ship sections into place. In the old world, they would have been turned away. In Kaiser's world, they were the future. Kaiser's philosophy was simple. You do not find skilled people, you create them. He refused to accept that mastery required bloodlines or tradition. What mattered was process: break a complex job into parts so simple that anyone could succeed. Each shift had its rhythm. Sparks rained from torches, boots echoed on steel, and across the yard, loudspeakers played swing music to keep the tempo. Under the floodlights, it looked less like war work and more like a vast mechanical ballet. Women became the soul of that rhythm. By 1943, more than 40,000 women worked in Kaiser's shipyards. They came in with fear and left with pride. At first, the men doubted them. Welding was dangerous, heavy, dirty. But soon it was clear that women brought something invaluable: patience, focus, steadiness of hand. Their seams were cleaner, their error rates lower. Supervisors began saying half-jokingly, "You want a straight weld? Find a woman." There were new faces, too. African-American workers who had long been locked out of skilled labor. At Richmond, they became welders, fitters, crane operators, foremen. In 1940s America, that was almost unthinkable. Yet here, the logic of speed over hierarchy broke the old barriers. If someone could weld a perfect seam, no one cared what color their skin was. Efficiency had made equality practical. For many, the shipyard was more than a job. It was a transformation. A former maid named Lillian Roberts later said, "When I struck my first arc and saw the metal melt under my hands, I realized I wasn't just earning money. I was building something that mattered." Her words captured what Kaiser had somehow understood all along: that production was not just physical, it was emotional. People worked harder when they believed they were part of history. The pace was exhausting. 3 shifts, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. The clang of cranes and welders never stopped. At night, the yard glowed orange against the dark bay, a man-made sunrise that never faded. Workers drank coffee by the gallon, slept in boarding houses, packed shoulder to shoulder, and still showed up before dawn. Some collapsed from fatigue, some lost hearing from the noise, some lost fingers to steel. Yet morale remained high. They were building ships faster than anyone thought possible. Kaiser knew that speed without humanity would collapse. He created cafeterias that served hot meals around the clock, child care centers, where mothers could leave their children safely, and even on-site clinics that treated injuries for free. Out of those clinics, a new idea was born: prepaid health care. The model would later evolve into Kaiser Permanente, one of the largest health systems in America. It began simply because one man refused to let exhaustion destroy his workers. Every payday, trains of new recruits arrived. Each day, another section of a ship rolled out of the assembly sheds. And each night, as workers walked home covered in soot and sweat, they passed the dock where the last Liberty ship had launched a reminder that everything they did, every spark they struck, pushed another vessel closer to the sea. The transformation went beyond skill. It touched identity. Housewives who once mended clothes now welded steel. Farmers who once sowed fields now planted bolts. The shipyard became a mirror of America itself, imperfect, chaotic, but awake. It taught people that greatness wasn't born, it was organized. By the end of 1943, Kaiser's untrained workforce had outperformed the most seasoned shipbuilders in the world. Their ships weren't elegant, they weren't meant to be. They were strong, reliable, and endless. In every spark that lit the night, there was a quiet defiance, proof that progress doesn't wait for permission. As one foreman said to a reporter watching a row of women lower their helmets and strike their torches, they said, "Ordinary people couldn't do this. Look around you. Ordinary is gone." By late 1942, what began as an experiment in speed had become an obsession that swept through every one of Kaiser's shipyards. The pace of production no longer followed the calendar, it followed a pulse. Ship after ship slid down the launchways, their names changing, but their rhythm the same one every few days, sometimes one every 48 hours. Reporters began printing build times like sports scores. Richmond Yard, number 2, 12 days. Oregon Shipbuilding, 10 days. The newspapers called it the race of steel. What had started as curiosity turned into rivalry. Clay Bedford Kaiser's chief engineer in California exchanged telegrams with Edgar Kaiser, his son, who managed the Oregon yards. The tone was half playful, half deadly serious. 10 days top, that one read. "We'll do it in 8, came the reply. The workers took those challenges personally. Pride spread through the yards like electricity. Every team wanted to be the one to break the next record. It was a competition without violence, a race fought not with bullets but with cranes, torches, and sweat. To outsiders it looked reckless. To those inside it was a new kind of warfare. Each day shaved from construction was another convoy saved from the Atlantic's wolves. For Kaiser, it was a living demonstration of what he had believed all along, that morale, not machinery, was the true engine of speed. He understood psychology as well as logistics. He knew that a factory could not run on schedules alone. It needed belief. He gave his people a simple creed: every hour counts. Those words appeared on posters throughout the yards, painted above cafeteria doors, printed on pay slips. It wasn't propaganda, it was truth. Germany's U-boats were sinking Allied ships faster than they could be replaced. The war in the Atlantic was a war of arithmetic. The side that mastered time would win. Inside the yards, the organization itself became a kind of choreography. Every shift change was timed like the handoff in a relay race. When the night shift ended, the day shift began without pause. The tools stayed warm. The steel stayed glowing. There were no wasted seconds. Foremen moved across the yard on bicycles and scooters, delivering orders like messengers in a battlefield. Schedulers tracked progress on massive chalkboards updated by the hour. To miss a target wasn't failure. It was treason against time. Yet, for all its intensity, the atmosphere carried something almost joyous. When a new record was broken, sirens wailed across the yard and the workers erupted in cheers. Someone would paint the new time 10 days or 7 days. On the side of a building in bright white letters, they weren't just building ships. They were rewriting what human effort could achieve. That spirit reached its peak in November 1942 when Bedford overheard Admiral Emory Land telling a group of reporters that Liberty ship production had improved remarkably but still lagged behind what mass production had achieved in other industries. Bedford took it as a challenge. That night he met with his team in the drafting office under the harsh white light of hanging bulbs. "He thinks we can't do better than 10 days," Bedford said, tapping his finger on the table. "We'll build one in 5. The room fell silent. Someone laughed nervously. 5 days sounded insane. But the more they talked, the more possible it seemed. Everything Kaiser had built, the prefabrication, the welding, the parallel work was leading to this. If they prepared every part beforehand, if they coordinated shifts perfectly, if not a single minute was wasted, it might just work. They called the project the 5-Day Ship. At 1 minute past midnight on Sunday, November 8, 1942, the attempt began. More than 1,000 workers gathered in the floodlit yard. Steel plates were already lined up sections, welded engines pre-assembled. As the first piece of keel touched the building, way the clock started. Crews rotated in 12-hour shifts, thousands of hands working in silence except for the thunder of machines. Sparks rained down in constant motion, a storm of orange light that never stopped. The air trembled with heat. By the second day, the hull had taken shape. By the third, the deck and cargo holds were complete. By the fourth, the engine, a 140-ton triple-expansion steam unit, was lowered into place and bolted down. On the 5th day, the final seams were sealed, the cranes retracted, and the hull stood gleaming under the morning sun. At exactly 3:30 in the afternoon, on November 12th, the ship named SS Robert E. Peary slid down the rails into the water. The clock read 4 days, 15 hours, 29 minutes. The crowd that gathered that day expected a publicity stunt, an empty hull for show. What they saw instead was a fully operational cargo ship ready for service within a week. Reporters scribbled furiously. Admiral Land, who had once doubted every line of Kaiser's plans, turned to the cameras and said, "6 months ago, I would have called this impossible. Today, it is the new standard." The ship became legend overnight. It was proof that the laws of industrial time could be broken. But behind that victory was something deeper than engineering. It was the belief that disciplined cooperation and trust could multiply human power. Each worker knew that a mistake could ruin the record. Yet no one faltered. In those 5 days, thousands of strangers became a single mind with a single heartbeat, a living demonstration of what shared purpose could do. When the Robert E. Peary touched the water, the workers cheered until their voices broke. Some wept. Others simply stared, unable to believe that they had built an entire ship faster than anyone had ever imagined. Henry Kaiser stood quietly on the platform, hands clasped behind his back. He didn't smile this time. He only whispered, "Now they'll know it can be done." The newspapers called it a miracle. Kaiser called it math. But for the men and women of Richmond, it was something else entirely, proof that speed wasn't recklessness, that order could come from chaos, and that ordinary people, when trusted, could move faster than anyone thought the human race could move. By early 1943, the rhythm of Henry Kaiser's shipyards had become the heartbeat of the Allied war effort. Each dawn in Richmond began the same way, the sound of thousands of boots on steel walkways, the flash of torches before the sun rose, the first siren marking another ship's completion. Across the West Coast in Oregon, Washington, and California, the same pattern repeated like a vast industrial symphony. And with every note struck in those yards, the balance of the war began to shift. At the start of 1942, the Allies were losing the Battle of the Atlantic. German submarines prowled the ocean like silent wolves, sinking merchant ships faster than they could be replaced. Tankers exploded in flames off the coast of Florida. Cargo convoys vanished in the dark mid-Atlantic. Britain's supplies of food oil and ammunition were shrinking to desperate levels. Churchill had warned Roosevelt that Britain was only months from starvation. In Washington, the numbers painted a bleak picture. 3.5 million tons of Allied shipping had gone to the ocean floor in 1 year alone. But then came the Liberty ships, crude, fast, and endless. In 1941, building one took 230 days. By mid-1943, the average time was 42. At the height of production, 3 new ships were launched every day. The math that had once favored Germany suddenly turned against it. For every vessel a U-boat destroyed, 2 more left the docks. Admiral Karl Dönitz, commander of the German submarine fleet, admitted later in his memoirs, "We could no longer sink ships fast enough." The Americans had made the sea itself their factory. What happened in those yards was more than industrial. It was psychological. For the first time since the war began, the Allies were no longer reacting. They were producing faster than the enemy could destroy. Supply lines that had once seemed fragile became unstoppable. Convoys grew larger, faster, and better armed. Tanks, planes, and food arrived in Britain in endless procession. The Liberty ship, plain and boxy, became a symbol of quiet power proof that victory could be welded, not just won. Even in Washington, attitudes shifted. Vice Admiral Howard Vickery, who had once dismissed Kaiser's simplified methods, now spoke of him as a visionary. In a report to the Maritime Commission, he wrote, "The old rulebook no longer applies. A shipyard is no longer a place of craft, but of system. Henry Kaiser has proven that speed and sufficiency win wars faster than perfection ever could." The old guard had been defeated not by argument, but by arithmetic. Kaiser's ships were not the prettiest, and some suffered structural flaws. A handful cracked in cold weather, but for every one that failed, hundreds succeeded. The critics faded into the background, replaced by engineers who came to study Kaiser's system, representatives from New York shipbuilding. Bethlehem Steel and Todd Pacific visited Richmond in disbelief. They returned home humbled, writing confidential reports that said what no shipwright had dared to say aloud. "If we do not adopt these methods, we will become obsolete." What they witnessed went beyond machines. It was the sight of an entire society learning to work as one organism. In Richmond alone, 100,000 people labored day and night. At peak production, the lights from the yard glowed so bright that pilots used them as navigation beacons when flying over the bay. It was said you could tell how close you were to Richmond by the flicker of sparks on the horizon. But inside that glare was humanity, tired, imperfect, determined. The cafeteria smelled of coffee and burnt metal. The sound of laughter mixed with the grinding of cranes. People celebrated births and mourned losses between shifts. They traded letters from husbands on the front lines and pinned them to bulletin boards under signs that read, "We build what keeps them alive." And they were right. The Liberty ships carried everything that made war possible: fuel for tanks, food for soldiers, steel for weapons. Each one could hold 440 tanks or nearly 3,000 jeeps or 230 million rounds of ammunition. When the invasion of North Africa began, those ships were there. When Sicily and Italy fell, those ships carried the supplies. And when D-Day came, a third of the cargo ships that landed on Normandy's beaches bore the same unglamorous name, Liberty. Henry Kaiser rarely visited Washington. He preferred to stay where the noise was. From his modest office above the yard, he read production reports late into the night. To him, every line of data, tons of steel used hours, saved defects corrected, was another front in the war. His philosophy had spread far beyond his own gates. 18 shipyards across America had now adopted his prefabrication methods. Collectively, they had produced over 2,000 Liberty ships by the middle of 1943. When a reporter once asked Kaiser if he felt pride in being called the miracle shipbuilder, he shook his head. "Miracles are what people call things they don't understand," he said. "This isn't a miracle. It's organization. It's people who stopped waiting for permission to do the impossible." By then, the war's tide had turned. German submarines found fewer targets. Convoys reached their destinations faster. The endless stream of gray Liberty ships marching across the Atlantic became a psychological blow as much as a logistical one. The message was clear. America could not be starved, could not be stopped, and could not be outbuilt. In the great equation of war, courage mattered. Leadership mattered. But numbers mattered most, and Henry Kaiser had changed the numbers. As one naval officer wrote at the time, battles are won by men, but wars are won by machines. And the machines that carry those men come from places like Richmond, from people who believe that time itself can be conquered. By 1944, the Richmond shipyards had become more than a workplace. They were a city unto themselves, pulsing day and night with the rhythm of war. The glow of welding arcs painted the fog above San Francisco Bay in flickering orange and blue, and the sound of cranes and hammering carried for miles across the water. Locals said the sky above Richmond never turned dark anymore. Even at midnight, the light from the shipyard shimmered against the clouds like a man-made dawn that refused to fade. What began as an empty patch of California mudflats 3 years earlier had turned into one of the largest industrial communities in the world. More than 100,000 people work there, living in hastily built houses, trailers and dormitories that sprawled in every direction. The population of Richmond had grown from 23,000 before the war to more than 100,000. Grocery stores appeared overnight. Cafeterias served meals around the clock. Movie theaters played double features for workers just coming off night shifts. It was as if someone had poured a small city out of a blueprint and told it to live. The rhythm of the yard never paused. At any given moment, somewhere in those 7 miles of waterfront, something was being welded, lifted, riveted, or launched. Day blended into night, weekdays into weekends. For the people who lived and worked there, time was measured not by calendars, but by ship 123, ship 208, ship 600. Each one had its own story, its own crew of builders, its own race against the clock. In this city of noise and fire, Henry Kaiser had built something else, a social experiment that few had seen before. His workforce was a cross-section of American men and women, black and white immigrants, and locals young and old. In a country still divided by race and class, Richmond was a rare place where people worked side by side toward a single goal. Efficiency had erased prejudice faster than politics ever could. In the rush to meet quotas, no one asked where you came from. The only question was whether you could keep up. That did not mean life was easy. The shifts were brutal. 12 hours bent over steel in noise and heat left people exhausted. Hands blistered, backs gave out. The smell of metal and oil clung to everything. Yet, for many, it was worth it. The paycheck was steady, the sense of purpose real. A woman named Alice Thompson, who welded cargo hold frames, once said, "It was hard, but it was the first time I ever felt like America needed me." Her words echoed the sentiment of thousands who found amid exhaustion and grime a new kind of belonging. Kaiser knew morale could not survive on patriotism alone. He built schools, cafeterias, laundries, and even dance halls inside the compound. The shipyard cafeterias served hot meals 24 hours a day, stew egg sandwiches, endless coffee. On Christmas Eve of 1943, Kaiser ordered a full holiday dinner for every worker on shift: turkey ham, mashed potatoes and pie, all served on steel tables between assembly lines. The Richmond Municipal Band played carols under the cranes, and a choir from a local church sang above the noise of welding. There were no decorations, no tree, just tired faces smiling under the glare of arc lights. For many, that dinner was the only Christmas they could afford. Kaiser also understood something few industrialists of his era did, that workers needed not just food and pay, but care. Injuries were common, and hospital bills could ruin families. To solve it, he partnered with a young doctor named Sidney Garfield to create the first prepaid medical plan for his employees. For 5 cents per day, a worker and their family could receive full medical care at the shipyard clinic. The program worked so well that it survived long after the war, eventually becoming Kaiser Permanente. What began as a wartime necessity became a peacetime legacy, proof that efficiency could also be compassion. The city that never slept had its shadows too. Families crowded into temporary housing without plumbing. Streets flooded in winter. Crime and drinking followed exhaustion. The shipyards consumed people's energy faster than they could recover it. Yet, even with all of that, few wanted to leave. There was a sense that what they were part of was bigger than themselves, something that might never happen again, a moment when ordinary life had been suspended and everyone was building something that mattered. At shift, change as the sight was unforgettable. Waves of workers poured through the gates, thousands at a time, faces smeared with soot jackets, heavy with sweat and metal dust. Some carried lunch pails, others just their gloves. Children stood at the fence waiting for their mothers. Trains lined up at the nearby depot, their windows glowing with tired faces, headed home to the shacks and barracks that filled the hills behind the yard. The city pulsed like a living heart, never resting, never slowing. From his office overlooking the harbor, Henry Kaiser often stayed late. The lights still burning long after midnight. He would stand by the window hands in his pockets watching the welders' sparks rise like fireflies into the fog. He once told a visitor, "This is what America looks like when it believes in something." And indeed, Richmond had become more than a shipyard. It was a vision of what America could be: imperfect, improvised, but unstoppable. A place where women learned they could build ships as strong as any man, where men learned that leadership meant service, and where strangers discovered that cooperation was stronger than division. The city that never slept and was not just building Liberty ships. It was building liberty itself steel by steel, hour by hour, under the relentless light of a world that refused to go dark. When the war finally began to turn in the Allies' favor, the shipyards of Richmond felt it first not through headlines or speeches, but through silence. The rush of new orders slowed, the telegrams grew fewer, and the whistles that once signaled another ship's launch came less often. By mid-1945, the Atlantic was secure. Convoys moved freely. Germany's submarines were defeated, and the arithmetic of destruction had been reversed. The endless race against time was finally over. But for Henry Kaiser, victory was never measured only in battles won or ships delivered. His real triumph was something larger, an idea that had taken shape in steel and flame. He had proven that human limitation was not fixed. That industry could be rebuilt, reinvented, and reborn whenever necessity demanded it. What he left behind was not just ships, but a blueprint for how the modern world would build everything that came after. At its peak, Kaiser's empire of shipyards stretched across the Pacific coast, 7 major facilities employing nearly 200,000 men and women. Together, they produced more than 1,400 vessels, Liberty ships, Victory ships, tankers, troop carriers, hospital ships. The numbers defied imagination. Between 1941 and 1945, America produced more than 53 million tons of shipping, more than all other nations combined. Nearly 1 out of every 3 vessels came from a Kaiser yard. The man who had once been mocked for never building a ship had become the builder of an entire fleet. Yet, as the world shifted from war to peace, the same efficiency that had been his greatest strength became his quiet undoing. The need for speed was gone. Orders were canceled. Workers were laid off. By early 1946, the shipyards that had once burned like furnaces of purpose now stood quiet. Empty cranes cast long shadows over vacant docks. Wind howled through the skeletons of half-built hulls. Entire neighborhoods built overnight to houseworkers emptied just as fast. Richmond, once alive with noise and light, seemed to exhale and fall asleep. But the knowledge remained. The prefabrication techniques, the modular design, the training systems, all of it spread far beyond California. In the 1950s, when Japan and South Korea rebuilt their industries, they studied Kaiser's shipyards as models. They copied his methods, sections built in parallel modules lifted by cranes, ships assembled like machines. Within 2 decades, those same nations would dominate global shipbuilding using principles born in Richmond. The modern shipyards of Nagasaki and Ulsan, where tankers and container ships the size of cities slide into the sea, trace their lineage directly to Kaiser's Liberty program. Even the failures of his welded ships became lessons. Metallurgists around the world studied the brittle fractures that had cracked a few Liberty hulls in high seas. They developed new steels, better welding procedures, safer standards. Those advances shaped everything from skyscrapers to oil refineries. The very buildings that rose in post-war America, bridges, pipelines, aircraft hangars, all bore the invisible mark of Henry Kaiser's revolution. His influence extended beyond steel. The healthcare system he built for his workers, born from compassion and practicality, evolved into Kaiser Permanente, one of the largest and most respected health organizations in the world. It became a model for preventive care long before the idea was fashionable. Millions would one day carry health cards with his name on them, unaware that it all began beside a shipyard where a man simply refused to let his workers suffer in silence. There was another legacy, too, one harder to measure, but no less real. The people who had worked under his light carried the experience with them for the rest of their lives. For many women, the shipyards had been their first taste of independence. They returned home different, confident, skilled, unwilling to return quietly to the kitchens and sewing tables that had defined them before. For thousands of African American workers, the war years opened doors that had been locked for generations. Some became machinists, managers, even business owners. The shipyard had taught them what was possible when talent was valued over tradition. In interviews, years later, many of them spoke of the same feeling that for a brief blinding moment they had been part of something greater than themselves. "We were just ordinary people," one welder said, "but for those years we were part of a miracle." Henry Kaiser moved on as he always did. He built new ventures, aluminum plants, car factories, a steel mill in Fontana, California, to feed his own shipyards before they closed. He even tried his hand at automobile manufacturing, driven by the same restless belief that anything could be simplified, systematized, improved. Some projects succeeded, some failed, but failure never seemed to trouble him. His measure of success was whether the world moved faster after he touched it. In his later years, journalists often asked what he thought of his shipbuilding legacy. He would smile and say, "We didn't just build ships. We built confidence. Confidence that people can do what they've never done before." And that was true. In a world still recovering from chaos, his story stood as a quiet reminder. Revolutions are not always fought with weapons. Some are fought with ideas, with courage to defy the phrase, "it can't be done." As the war faded into history, the last Liberty ships sailed under foreign flags, carrying grain, oil, and freight. One of them, the SS John W. Brown, built in 1942, still floats in Baltimore, today preserved as a museum. Another, the SS Jeremiah O'Brien, returned to Normandy in 1994 to mark the 50th anniversary of D-Day, the same ship that had once carried supplies to those beaches half a century earlier. When it arrived, the veterans who had survived the landings stood on deck and saluted. The ships had outlived the war. Outlived their builders, outlived even the reason for their existence. And yet they remained rusted, weathered, still afloat, a reminder that what begins as urgency can end as legacy. And behind it all, the same truth endured: the impossible is only impossible, until someone refuses to believe it. The last Liberty ship left the docks on October 30, 1945. Her name was SS Albert M. Bow. She slid into the gray waters of the Pacific quietly, without a crowd, without fanfare, and without the urgency that had once defined her kind. The war was over. The world was breathing again. No one counted the hours or measured the welds. The race that had once consumed a nation was finished. The cranes stood still, the torches dark, the air empty. For the men and women who had lived by the rhythm of shipbuilding, the silence felt almost unbearable. They had spent years chasing a clock that never stopped believing every spark could decide the fate of the world. Now, with peace restored, time itself seemed too quiet. Many workers packed their bags and returned to lives they had nearly forgotten, to farms, schools, offices, and homes that no longer felt the same. They had seen what people could do when there was no such word as impossible, and ordinary life suddenly seemed smaller. Henry Kaiser stood on the pier one final time that winter watching his shipyard fade into stillness. Where thousands of workers once stood shoulder to shoulder, only gulls circled above empty rails. He could still see it in his mind, the glow of arc light over the bay, the roar of engines lowering a ship into the water, the voices shouting, "We did it." It had been more than a business, more than a war effort. It had been a moment when belief itself became a tool. The Liberty ships had carried the Allies across oceans, but they also carried something less visible proof of what organized human will could do. In less than 5 years, they had turned mudflats into factories, farmers into welders, skeptics into believers. They had rewritten the math of war, and with it, the psychology of progress. Every modern factory, every construction site, every logistics network that prizes speed and system over tradition owes something to those 5 years of fire. Most of the Liberty ships are gone now. Some were sunk in battle, others sold to foreign fleets, others simply worn down by time. A few survived: the John W. Brown in Baltimore, the Jeremiah O'Brien in San Francisco. When the O'Brien sailed back across the Atlantic in 1994 for the 50th anniversary of D-Day, old welders and shipyard workers came to see her. Some were in wheelchairs. Some walked with canes, but when the ship's horn sounded, they stood at attention. For a moment, they were back in Richmond, young again, covered in soot, believing the world could change if they only worked fast enough. On deck that day, one of the veterans ran his hand along the steel railing and whispered, "We built her." The steel was cold, but the memory was warm. That ship, born in months of urgency, had outlived almost everyone who had made her. She was a monument not to war, but to what human beings can create when they stop waiting for permission to begin. In the decades that followed, the lessons of the Liberty shipyards rippled across industries. Prefabrication became the standard in construction, from skyscrapers to submarines. Welding replaced riveting in nearly every form of heavy manufacturing. Factories learned to train workers in days, not years. Even modern software development borrows from Kaiser's principal divide. The task: simplify the process, build in parallel. The DNA of Richmond runs quietly through the veins of the modern world. But the deepest lesson wasn't mechanical. It was moral. The Liberty ships taught that genius can be collective, that 1,000 ordinary people, when organized around purpose, can outthink and outbuild the few who guard tradition. They proved that innovation doesn't belong to the elite, but to those who dare to try. And they reminded the world that the tools of progress are not only machines, but faith, courage, and trust. When Henry Kaiser died in 1967, the newspapers remembered him as the man who built the impossible. But those who had worked for him remembered something quieter: how he would walk the docks at night shaking hands, asking workers about their families, telling them, "You matter. You're the reason this ship will sail." Today, when people visit the preserved Jeremiah O'Brien in San Francisco, they often stop at the bridge where a small plaque bears his name. Beneath it, the words read simply, "He built ships faster than the world thought possible." But those words don't tell the whole story. The truth is, he didn't just build ships. He built belief in the power of ordinary people, in the strength of organization, in the idea that effort itself can be sacred when it serves something larger than profit or pride. Standing on that deck today, you can still hear the echo of that age, the clang of steel, the hiss of welding, the laughter in the cafeterias, the midnight music drifting over the bay. You can still imagine the sparks rising into the fog, like stars being born. And if you listen closely, you can almost hear Henry Kaiser's voice, calm and certain, carried on the wind. "Don't tell me it can't be done," he might say. "Show me how fast you can do it." Because in the end, that was the heart of his legacy. Not just that he proved the impossible could be done, but that he showed the world who could do it. Not the privileged, not the chosen, but the ordinary, the farmers, the teachers, the secretaries, the housewives, those who had never been told they could shape history, until one man gave them the tools and said, "Go ahead. Try." And they did. They built a ship every 4 days. They changed the tide of a war. And in doing so, they built something far greater, the enduring truth that human potential once awakened can never be put back to sleep. Would you like me to provide an epilogue, summarizing the entire 10-part story in a cinematic closing paragraph, like the narration of a documentary's final scene?